This is a speedrun of Excavate, a game developed by Scriptwelder. You can play it on arborgames.com. This run is somewhat unusual in that most speedruns go for minimum time to completion. Here I'm going for the minimum number of turns to completion. The game is designed to be beaten in 14 turns. In this run, which is currently a world record, I'll be beating it in 7 turns. So before we jump into the run, I want to very briefly go over my team layout. Don't want to go into too much detail here, but first thing you'll notice is maximize strength for every character. This is simply to maximize the number of action points they have per turn, and also to make them all capable diggers and gardeners, because those are the 2 actions that you absolutely need to be able to optimize. Got 1 person with maximum charisma who will be in charge of messages, 1 person with maximum intellect for cataloging items, 1 person with maximum perception who will be in charge of exploring ruins, and then the 4th one, I honestly don't know at this point what's optimal for the 4th character. They're probably going to be spending all their action points on digging anyway, so I'm not really worried about it. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump into the run. At the opening of the game, there are 3 upgrades that are worth getting: gloves, secateur, and old maps. Depending on your team setup, you might be able to afford all 3. Here I just go for gloves and old maps. So the game starts off by sort of forcing you to go through a tutorial. It's not strictly necessary to do things in the order that they recommend, but it's nice to get through it eventually so you can stop having those icons blinking green. One thing you'll notice in this first turn, I have 2 objectives. One is to dig 1 level deep on every tile in the crypt, and the other is to identify every structure on the map. 2 big reasons for this. One is you get a pretty substantial cash bonus for identifying every tile of a structure. It's $100 per structure. And the other reason is you want to try to avoid digging more than 1 layer deep on the first few turns for a couple of reasons. The biggest one being that digging is a really inefficient action early on, but it becomes much more efficient later on. So you want to try to offload as much of the digging as you can to later in the game when you have better upgrades. I'm going to fast forward the process of digging up the crypt just to cut down the length of the video. I'm going to be doing this a few times throughout the run. Now that the crypt is uncovered, it's time to inspect the map. 3 things you want to keep in mind when inspecting. First, you should only use characters with a high combined perception and intelligence. Second, if you're going to be running this game, you should memorize the size and shape of each of the 4 structures. Third, this is the most random element of the game. Sometimes you'll get lucky and be able to find a structure on your first click. Other times you don't, and it just ruins your run. In this case, I did get lucky on this first shot. Now I'm just going to clean up a few things, respond to messages. My rule of thumb is for the first few turns, with your charisma person, just take care of every message. 2 things: A, it gives you extra cash, B, it builds up a nice pool of creditability, which you're going to be abusing later on, so it's nice to be able to build that up early. So I don't know what the structure is yet. I'm digging down, and I believe it turns out to be the church foundations, which is annoying. Church foundations you really want to identify later on because it takes so long to identify the whole thing and to clear the whole thing that should really be your last objective. So I don't have anything else I can do. I'm going to end the turn. So you can see if you play your first turn efficiently, you should get a bunch of nice cash bonuses, which I'm going to use to buy secateur and the hatchet. I'm not going to bother with the extra maps. You don't really need them. Second turn, you get a little warning about posting people to guard duty, which I ignore throughout the entire run. The thing with guard duty is most of the bad things that can happen from people invading the camp are negligible. For most of the game, if people steal your artifacts, it doesn't matter. You don't need cash later on. If they steal your equipment, usually you have enough cash left over that you can just buy it again. Probably the most annoying thing that can happen when people invade your camp is they undig things, they bury some of your structures. The thing is, if you're playing efficiently, that won't matter. Because if you clear a structure, that flag within the game that the structure is cleared doesn't get undone by the thieves coming in and burying things again. You only need to clear tiles once. The other thing to keep in mind with guard duty is that it takes a lot of action points in order to mitigate the risk by any significant amount. And even if the risk is high, there's always the possibility that the thieves won't come. So you're better off just not bothering. Anyway, so on the second turn, again, we're going to be focusing on inspecting the playfield and digging one level deep on the structures that we have identified. So here we've already identified where the belfry is, so we're going to dig onto that before we move on to the cenotaph. Here I'm going to use my perception character to explore a few tiles and gain some artifacts, which we'll be cataloging later. For most of the game, you'll notice that I don't bother cataloging my items because you don't need the extra money, and it's kind of a waste of action points. But it is good to get a little bit of extra cash and a little bit of extra creditability during the first few turns. So that's why I'm doing that here. Once I've done that, it's time to find the cenotaph. So here with these inspections, I get a little bit of bad luck in that my first click didn't really tell me anything useful. And then my second click gives me some information about where the church is, but it's not really relevant right now. So it takes 3 clicks to find the cenotaph, which isn't great, but what are you going to do? Once you've identified all the structures on the field, play becomes a bit more straightforward, a bit simpler to optimize. What we're trying to do is get our upgrades as early as possible. And so to do that, we're going to try to get the clearing cash bonuses as early as possible. And in order to do that, I believe the optimum strategy is to clear the smallest structures first and then work towards the largest structure. Think about it, the cenotaph and the belfry combined have only 5 tiles, which is roughly half the size of the crypt. So if your team is able to fully clear 5 tiles per turn, then if you focus on the cenotaph and the belfry first, with those 5 tiles cleared, you'll get $200 of cash bonus in 1 turn. Whereas if you were to focus on the crypt first, it would take 2 turns to clear the whole thing, and you would only get $100 of cash bonus. So here I catalog some items just to get a little bit of extra cash. I'm just fast forwarding through this. Then with the remaining action with my intelligence character, I'm going to explore just to try to reduce the ambiguity in the position of the church. Right now there's 2 positions it could possibly be in, but now we know there's only 1 possible layout. So we'll finish the day, collect our cash, including some bonuses, and then we're going to get some of the important upgrades. We want to improve the efficiency of digging, and we want to improve the efficiency of exploring. As I mentioned earlier, this will allow a high perception character to explore ruins for 1 action point, which really ramps up the efficiency. From here on, the play becomes mechanically pretty straightforward. We're just going to execute on the strategy that we set ourselves up to do, which is to clear tiles, starting with the smaller structures first. One thing that's worth pointing out is that when you clear a structure, or clear a tile, that's when you get to level 5 of 5 in the digging, it's worth noting that there are artifacts on the bottom layer, but you don't actually need to collect those. It's not a victory condition to collect every artifact of every ruin. It's just a victory condition to clear every tile. So you can save yourself a bunch of action points just by ignoring the artifacts that live at the very bottom. Here I'm going to spend my cash on upgrades to continue to improve the efficiency of cutting and digging. Particularly with cutting, I noticed at the end of the last turn that there were a lot of tiles on the church foundations that had plants on them. So it's not always necessary to get the top tier upgrade, but here, because there's so many plants that need to be cut down, it's worth getting the chainsaw. The other thing worth mentioning when it comes to upgrades is in the bottom left, there's a very expensive upgrade called Training for $800. If you've never gotten that one before, what it does is it randomly gives each team member 1 extra skill point in something. You don't have any control over it. For $800, that is awful. If it's not already obvious why that's so bad, the thing to keep in mind is that your team members should be specialized, and in whatever task that they're specialized in, the relevant statistics should already be maxed out. So whatever points you get from the training will go toward skills that aren't being used. So it's just a total waste of money. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward here. This part is pretty straightforward. In a moment, I'm going to catalog some items, which gives us some cash to buy the last upgrade, but more importantly, it gives us extra creditability points. The larger your pool of creditability points, the more often you can ignore messages. The reason you want to do that is because later on, when you're trying to finish the game as quickly as possible, the action points that you're spending on messages should be spent on digging and exploring. So building up that credibility pool really helps to more efficiently distribute your action points. The reason creditability is relevant is if your creditability score ever drops below 0, you will automatically lose the game, even during the middle of a turn. Here, don't bother buying any upgrades. There's nothing else that I need, though we do have some extra cash, so if any of your equipment gets stolen by intruders, you should be able to replace it with no problems. This is going to be the last day of the run, so you'll notice that I am ignoring all of the messages that come in. And here I do a little bit of mental math and realize that I don't have enough action points in order to be able to fully explore and dig each of the tiles in the church foundations. If I tried to do that, it would push me into day 8. Here I dig a few tiles without having explored them first. This destroys the artifacts and makes you lose a few credibility points. The number of points that you lose by doing that scales up the more times you do it. So the first time you dig, you lose 5 credibility, second time 10, third time 15, so on and so forth. So you can't do it too many times in a run. Everything's cleared, so go ahead and end the day. You see I lose a bunch of credibility points from messages I had ignored, but we had enough built up that it doesn't matter. And there you have it. That is Excavate completed in 7 days, world record.